All right, everyone, just want to let you know, as we're watching these two huge stories today, we're keeping an eye on the fires, but we also want to talk a little bit more about the shooting that took place. Joining us right now, Dr. Carole Lieberman, a forensic psychiatrist, and we just want to start with, what do we know about, what have you observed, what have you heard? We've heard a lot about, he served in the Marines, was there PTSD, what can you share? What did you observe?
Well, one of the interesting, of course, when something like this happens, you start hearing little pieces of things, and we all try to put it together and make a comprehensible story out of it. But one of the things that stick out is that this is another example of something that could have been prevented if he had gotten psychiatric treatment. Like, that they, particularly at least this one time in April when they came to his house because the neighbors called, there was this disturbance, and they called the crisis team, the psychiatric crisis team, and the crisis team decided he was not a danger to himself or others, so he couldn't be on a 5150. Well, obviously they were wrong, and we saw this with the Parkland shooter. The same thing happened. He had those opportunities, and they decided, they didn't hospitalize him, and we know what happened there. So that's one of the things. I heard an interview of his coach, his high school baseball coach, where he said that he would put a word for each of the team members, and the word that he put for him was intense. That he was respectful and polite and so on, but he was very intense. So
he was a Marine, though.
Well, yes, that's the thing that's interesting.
It's not uncommon, right?
No, it's not uncommon for Marines to be intense.
No, yeah.
Well, that's true, but this was before he became a Marine. This was in high school.
Of course, yeah, right.
So, so it's interesting that something obviously was brewing then, but he got it. He made it through the Marines, and he was there for a while, and there's no any trouble.
Not only that, he had honors, including a good conduct medal.
Yes. So what I think is a good possibility is that yes, he had PTSD, and maybe he had two car accidents, after he got back, and he was a victim of an assault in a bar in Thousand Oaks, which is kind of interesting that he then chose another bar in Thousand Oaks to do this at. And so perhaps he had PTSD, he obviously wasn't getting sufficient treatment, and he may well have been trying to self-medicate with alcohol or drugs. That could explain the car accidents. He could have been hit in the head in the bar assault. In other words, there could be things in addition to PTSD that were bothering him. And it's so interesting that they gathered things from his home, so many things from his home. And you have to, as someone who's an expert in terrorism, of course it makes me think, do we really know that he isn't inspired by ISIS?
Right. Well, we don't have a motive yet. We don't have any further indication as to why he went into that bar on that night. Was there something personal brewing at that bar with somebody who knew there? We don't know. We're not hearing yet from the mother or FBI investigators giving us that information. So the investigators who went in and confronted him before decided he wasn't a risk enough to hospitalize him. That's their job to determine that. I mean, how do you know someone's going to go to this lengths with their suffering?
Well, you should be able to know, quite frankly. You can't predict 100%, but I'm sure if he just got finished, tearing the house apart, if you spend enough time talking to him, you could find out that this wasn't just sort of some random isolated incident, and they should have erred on the side of caution, and that's the problem. We talked about this before in regard to the Parkland shooter, that the problem is that mental health professionals, they're afraid to be sued or whatever. They don't take the risk of putting that person in the hospital, which they should do, just to make sure that even just for 3 days, a 72-hour hold, to make sure that the person is really okay.
Such a tough situation, Dr. Lieberman. Honestly, he was a decorated Marine. Aside from the Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal that Christine mentioned, he also was awarded, I should say, or given or bestowed a Combat Action Ribbon. He was discharged honorably. So, like you said, it's predicting the future. There is no crystal ball. How? There are these red flags, but
well,
how are we supposed to know somebody's going to do what happened last night?
Somewhere after all those medals and what happened last night, there were signs of things from the tearing the house apart and other signs. And I think we may find out that it speaks to the fact, you know, there are a lot of veterans who don't get the proper treatment once they get back. I mean, I think that's definitely going to be a part of the story as well.
Well, I saw somebody respond on my social media to one of my postings saying it's terribly sad in many ways, and that might be one of the stories there about treatment, about PTSD.
Right.
What message do you want to put out there?
Well, I think, you know, people, the neighbors seem to notice that there was something wrong with him. I think people there needs to be less of a stigma to mental illness. People need to make sure that if they suspect anything, you know, that they help the people, that they get them into treatment, and not to feel like, oh, you know, or not to listen if the person doesn't really want to go. You can still do things to encourage them to go. And if it's the VA, you know, obviously a lot has to be done with the VA system to get more treatment. So many people commit suicide waiting to be seen and treated by the VA.
Big
so
problem.
whether it's suicide or the flip side, homicide, it is a big problem.
The weapon was purchased legally in Simi Valley. I mean, there were all these big questions that were asked that seemed that were answered, but the big question of why, motive, we don't know yet, and we may never know. But we will try to find out.
Carole Lieberman.
Carole Lieberman, thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you coming in.